Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this workshop about securing the web forward. I must say that I really like the reference to test the web forward and move the web forward, and a whole bunch of grassroots efforts that have done so much to improve the web over the last close to 2 decades at this point. My name is Toby Langell, and I don't have a deck. I'm going to share with you sort of like very briefly what I'm working on the jQuery, which for those who know me, is an interesting turn of events, as there was a time a long time ago where jQuery and the prototype JavaScript framework, which was the open source framework that I was heavily involved with, were essentially competing against one another. And then, that was a long time ago, and a whole bunch of things happened. And jQuery had this incredible meteoric success. And close to 15 years later, might be at this point, I'm kind of back working into the front-end JavaScript framework world, and it's interesting to be back there, and it's a fun turn of events. Well, there's two things. There's a background to this, which I think we're all very much aware of, which is essentially the rise of the web and JavaScript, and all of this technology going very mainstream over the course of those 2 decades. And my kids are coming in home right now, and I'm going to go close my office door. Sorry about this. And sorry, and as a result, we're faced like these huge security issues that we've seen grow over the last few years around open source, and increasing concerns around supply chain and attacks and open source being such a big part of all of the web stack, that obviously security concerns around it impact everything. And so there's a lot of effort put into this. And the OpenSSF has launched this new, very ambitious project called Alpha Omega. And as part of the alpha Omega project, which is focused on, I think it's 100 sort of like high stakes project, there's been a budget allocated to working to secure jQuery, which is the effort I'm involved with through the OpenJS Foundation. And what's really interesting about this is, whereas a lot of the focus on securing open source is really focused on backend open source, backend work, and the specific security constraints of that, jQuery is among one of the very rare ones that's actually essentially a front-end tool. And that has an entirely different security story, an entirely different set of concerns, which I thought were super interesting to bring back into a conversation that's essentially overlapping web and JavaScript. And so, that's why I offered to talk about this here. And to me, what's really interesting is, well, before I get into like the specific of what's interesting about front-end security compared to the rest of software security, I just want to share a few stats about jQuery. I actually don't have the references or the sources with me, but essentially, if you look at the number of websites deployed in the world today, you're talking about roughly 1.5 billion websites. And it turns that about two-thirds of this 1.5 billion websites are actually running jQuery, which is like entirely staggering, right? And so essentially, yeah, right, it's like mind-blowing. There's essentially a billion websites that are running jQuery today. And the other really wild stat around this is about half of this billion So 500 million, a third of the web is running outdated and unpatched version of jQuery, right? And so OpenJSF has commanded a whole study around this, and the results are going to be shared like soonish at this point. But so, it's really interesting to have this piece of software which is, yeah, so ubiquitous, and also that suffers from, the issues that a lot of open source suffers from, i.e., very few people actually working on it. It's not, there's not a lot of maintenance, not a lot of resources poured into it. And that's a really interesting situation. And one of the stats that's really interesting is whereas a lot of respondent to the study that was commended by OpenJSF, mentioned security concerns and having had security issues, they're generally not tied directly to jQuery, even if they're running on patch versions, right? And that ties into my other point, which is the huge difference between software run in the browser and software run elsewhere is the browser sandbox, right? There's a whole security model that is there to protect and prevent things from going really bad in browser and JavaScript land in the browser. And so it kind of puts the question, it begs the question as to, well, what exactly does it mean to secure something like jQuery? Like, how can, what hole can jQuery open in the sandbox that doesn't exist without jQuery? And I think that that's a really interesting question to think about, especially if we're thinking about developer experience and sort of making it easier for developers to do the right thing. And that's kind of the conversation that I'm hoping to have today. And one conversation that I feel has been very much missing, which is if you're building front-end code, what exactly are the things that where you can really create issues that cannot be defended by the sandbox, right? And what are we doing collectively as an industry to try to prevent those? And also, what can libraries or other tools, but libraries like jQuery, do to sort of essentially make best practices the default or the go-to option of front-end development? And so really that's really what I would want to be able to talk about is, well, first of all, identify those security concerns, those security issues that affect code that is sandboxed by the browser. And as a first step, as a second step, figure out how we can document them and communicate them clearly to developers. And as a third step, figure out how collectively we can improve the odds of those issues not happening. So it's a fairly different take than, for example, the conversations that we had yesterday. It's fairly constrained by the browser sandbox. But I think it's something where we could collectively do a lot more, because when I actually went looking to figure out, well, what exact security issues can jQuery create, turns out that I couldn't find lots of documentation on this. And so, it would be great if that kind of documentation was easier to find, which is also why I'm excited to see people from Open Web Docs being here today. I think it's great. So yeah, essentially that's really what I wanted to share. I'm happy to answer questions if folks have questions.